I'm going to call to order the Thursday, October 17th meeting of the Planning Board. I'm going to take one matter out of order, and I'm just going to ask first for board member comments. First, I'd like to welcome as well the town manager and assistant town manager to our meeting. Matt, any comments this meeting?
No comments at this time.
Dino?
None.
None.
Perna?
No
None?
comments.
Julie?
Nope.
And Tim?
No comments.
Okay, no comments. And my only comment is I just want to welcome Mr. Fitzgerald as our newest member to the planning board. Mr. Fitzgerald's coming over from the zoning board and does have a background in construction and can read a set of plans, which is a good thing. Next item of business is the reorganization of the board. My thoughts are that just as Tim is just getting on board, that we continue this matter to our next meeting, and at that point, we can see what everybody is comfortable with in terms of our board structure. So this is not a public hearing on that. So if everybody's in agreement with that, I guess I would entertain a motion to continue the discussion about reorganization of board and the who are the chair, vice chair, clerk, et cetera, until the next meeting, which is Thursday, October 24th.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So that is continued until Thursday, October 24th. Next, public hearings for this meeting, which all relate to zoning warrant articles. So I would ask the clerk if she could read the legal notice that was published.
Certainly. In accordance with the provisions of Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 5, the Shrewsbury Planning Board will hold a public hearing on Thursday, October 17th, 2024 at 7 p.m. in the Shrewsbury, in the Shrewsbury Town Hall at 100 Maple Ave, Shrewsbury, Mass, regarding proposed amendments to the Shrewsbury zoning bylaw as follows. Article to see if the town will vote to amend the zoning bylaw of the town of Shrewsbury, Section 7, Table 1, Use Regulation Schedule, to add pub brewery to the business uses, restaurants, indoor and outdoor service, and restaurants, indoor service only, use cases, and to replace references to brew pub with pub brewery for consistency with Massachusetts liquor licensing laws, or to take any other action in relation thereto. Article to see if the town will vote to amend the zoning bylaw of the town of Shrewsbury, Section 2A, definitions, to amend the definition of lot frontage with regard to easements, and amend Section 4, continuance of existing uses, to add a new Section 4F to include protections for lots and structures rendering non-conforming by takings by eminent domain, or to take any other action in relation thereto. Article to see if the town will vote to amend the zoning bylaw of the town of Shrewsbury, Section 2A, definitions, Section 7U7, accessory dwelling units, and Section 7C, accessory units, to move the accessory dwelling units provisions into the accessory uses section, with amendments to align with the Affordable Homes Act, Chapter 150 of the Acts of 2024, or to take any other action in relation thereto. An article to see if the town will vote to amend the zoning bylaw of the town of Shrewsbury, Section 2A, definitions, amend the definition of mixed-use development, vertical mix, and mixed-use development, horizontal mix, in Section 3A, establishment of districts, insert transit-oriented development overlay district. In Section 3B, district intent, insert narrative describing the transit-oriented development overlay district as intended to encourage additional smart growth and transit-oriented development. satisfy the requirements of Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A, and contribute to the town's housing growth goals. In Section 3, districts, insert in Section 3A, establishment of districts, a new Section 710 to be entitled TOD Overlay District, and to amend the zoning map of the town of Shrewsbury by adding the TOD Overlay District as shown on the exhibit plan on file with the office of the town clerk, or to take any other action in relation thereto. The complete text, where applicable, may be seen during regular business hours in the Office of Planning and Economic Development Department, the Office of the Town Clerk at the Municipal Office Building at 100 Maple Ave, and the Shrewsbury Public Library at 609 Main Street.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to request the board take up a motion to withdraw the zoning articles as proposed with the exception of the MBTA zoning, which we will proceed with this evening. The balance of those articles would be withdrawn.
Okay. Contemplating consideration for the Springtown meeting,
Correct, yep.
spring of 2025 town meeting. I am okay with that. Do any board member comments? Do you have any comments?
No, in fact, I'll make that motion.
Bernie, you have any comments on that?
No comment, Chair.
Matt, you have any comments?
No, no comments.
Julie, any comments on that? Tim, any comments?
No, I do not.
I think it makes sense, because I think that, consideration of the MBTA zoning amendments, assuming, will be a time-consuming and a pretty big task at town meeting. As this is a public hearing, I would ask that if any members in the audience have any comments relative to if this board withdraws the brew pub, easement and frontage, and AUD zoning warrant articles from consideration at the upcoming town meeting. Seeing no comments, I would entertain a motion to withdraw Article 10, Article Roman numeral 20, Section Roman numeral number 2, update restaurant definitions to add brew pub. Article Roman numeral number 20, Section 7, capital B, easements and frontage, and Roman numeral number 20, Section 2 and Section 6 relative to accessory dwelling units. Do I have a motion?
I'll make that motion.
Second.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Okay. Next, we have for consideration Article 20, Section 3, A, B, C, and Section Roman numeral number 7, Section 10, new MBTA zoning. And I guess I would ask Chris if he could start with the presentation.
Thank you. So prior to getting in the presentation, I just want to give a brief talking points here. On October 10th, staff received the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities pre-adoption review feedback letter. I'm pleased to report there were no findings in relation to our proposal which conflict with the 3A legislation or guidelines. EUHLC did include 5 recommended technical corrections for consideration. Staff is currently in the process of reviewing these considerations with Town Council and will adjust the proposal accordingly. Although we are still evaluating specific adjustments to be made, I do have some slides prepared this evening which will dive into a little more detail on those recommendations and how we anticipate addressing them. To frame this evening's discussion, I'd like to briefly recap the events which have brought us here this evening. This zoning proposal has been drafted in order to satisfy the requirements of MGL Chapter 40A, Section 3A, which were instituted as a legislative mandate. This proposal was drafted by staff in February of this year in coordination with public engagement through community forums and the MBTA preference survey. It has been the subject of both public and professional review and discussion by town legal staff, municipal staff, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, the Attorney General's Office, Select Board meetings, and Planning Board public hearings. We are confident in our ability to bring this proposal, which has now been thoroughly vetted, to town meeting floor, and to deliver on our responsibility to the community to allow them an opportunity to vote on a proposal which they can be confident will satisfy the requirements of MGL Chapter 40A, Section 3A. You will recall when I last spoke to this item with the Planning Board, I asked that we shift the conversation from the broad politics of the legislative mandate and focus instead on the matter which will be before town meeting to vote on November 18th. Specifically, the language of our proposal, which largely remains unchanged from its original form. I would ask that we now take up that discussion tonight and at the Planning Board public hearing scheduled on October 24th at 7 p.m. I'll be happy to answer any questions you or the public will have between now and November 18th. With that, I do have a number of brief slides I'd like to present prior to opening for questions. What specifically are we proposing? The zoning article TOD overlay proposes to create a new overlay zoning district to meet compliance with MGL Chapter 40A, Section 3A, the multifamily zoning requirement for MBTA communities. The proposed zoning takes a transportation-oriented development approach to achieve this compliance while encouraging traditional mixed-use development and expanding upon existing local design guidelines which have generated successful projects locally. This is our timeline update to show where we are. We'll be using that screen for comment collection later, so we have it over here. But, yeah. This is our timeline update to show where we are procedurally. I briefly touched on the process which led to the development of the draft proposal in February, and there's a lot more that has been done prior to this evening that isn't reflected here in the slide, but I wanted to highlight some important dates. At the conclusion of this evening, we will be asking the board to continue this hearing to the special meeting scheduled next Thursday, October 24th. On that date, we will address any open questions from this evening and request the board to close the hearing. The board will then vote on their recommendation that evening or on the October 30th date. Fall town meeting is scheduled for November 18th, where the community will vote on this article. The deadline for compliance is December 31st, so the fall town meeting vote in November will determine the community's compliance status. In addition to developing this proposal, staff has closely tracked the compliance status of our peer communities. This is a map by Barrett Planning Group that shows the compliance status of other communities. 77 of the 177 communities have adopted zoning in relation to this mandate and are in varying stages of review by EOHLC for formal compliance. 15 communities have proposed zoning which has failed, and 2 communities are currently in non-compliant status. As we evaluate our strategy for compliance, it's important that we be clear both about community needs and potential risks. We've discussed previously the grants which the community would become ineligible for under a non-compliant status. We've discussed the town's consistent utilization of those grants for significant infrastructure, local studies, and community initiatives. The town recently received $500,000 in Housing Choice Grant funds to support the Green Street to South Street Connector Road project. The award letter specifically ties that funding to MBTA compliance, and we have real-world examples of EOHLC clawing back funding from non-compliant projects. It has been noted that some of those larger grants, including the recent Connector Road grant, are tied to housing development. And it's important to be clear that these are often examples of the town leveraging private development that is already being proposed to address existing local needs. The Green Street Connector helps address existing traffic safety and circulation objectives to further improve upon the anticipated benefits of the proposed Route 20 improvements. The Route 20 sewer extension and the Centex site readiness grants helped facilitate and unlock significant commercial opportunities which are crucial to balancing the residential tax burden and promoting local business development. While evaluating compliance, I think it's important to also ask the question, is there a path to compliance that supports community needs while avoiding these risks? I presented previously that the design guidelines are a key feature in guiding what will actually be developed. In accordance with our community feedback, one of the limiting factors is building height, which we have placed at 2.5 stories. Rather than parsing through some of the specific language, I wanted to dive deeper on some of the examples which we would expect this zoning to facilitate. Some local examples include Water's Edge, Minna Terrace, and Eastern Point. Mashpee Commons is a good example of a mixed-use project, which would be of similar scale if a commercial component is included, while the smallest structure in Mayflower Manor in Middleborough is an example of the maximum height, which is permitted at 2.5 stories by utilizing a mansard roof. Understanding that scale, we can look to the location this district is proposed. We have placed this district in between routes 9 and 20, primarily overlaying Shrewsbury Commons, 409 South Street, and Emerald Run. This connects the district to 2 major transit corridors while overlaying parcels that are already existing, approved, or proposed for higher density housing, limiting to the extent practical the generation of new housing units. Going more in depth on those parcels, we have compared these existing, approved, and proposed projects with the compliance models calculation. In addition to the figures, I think it's important to consider the massing of the existing structures and project renderings in the context of our maximum 2.5 story height. Summing up the district details, the compliance model estimates the district would support 924 net new units at full build-out. The reality is likely lower due to the development constraints and the approved and proposed 40B projects, which already effectively ignore zoning and illustrate the realities of what could be developed. Finally, I want to touch on the pre-adoption feedback more specifically and address where we are currently with that. The first comment recommends review of our adaptive reuse provisions. This requirement would have the developer review any existing structures for incorporation into the proposed project prior to demolition. Given the context of the district, we do not see this as a priority item to keep. There are very few structures within the district that are conducive to this type of analysis anyways. Regardless, we will be reviewing this with town council as recommended to make an adjustment as necessary. The second comment recommends review of our existing site plan approval process to ensure that the standards set forth are objective. We are in the process of reviewing this recommendation and will make any necessary adjustments required. The third comment recommends adjusting our existing off-street parking requirements to define visitor and employee parking in more exact terms, or exempting the district from this language. The currently proposed 1.5 spaces per unit figure is acceptable. It is simply the following undefined term of sufficient which is being questioned here. The fourth comment recommends revising the existing bylaw definition of family or otherwise exempting the district from this definition. This definition primarily applies to regulating in-law apartments, which have become an obsolete use. Staff is developing a zoning proposal to remove this use anticipated for the 2025 annual town meeting. And finally, the fifth comment recommends including rights-of-way into the shapefile. I've included a graphic here of our understanding of the comment. Essentially, the district shapefile should overlay roadways regardless of local practice. Our office has no issue with making this minor adjustment. And with that, I'd like to open it back to the board.
Okay. I guess that, Dino, do you have any comments relative to the presentation or the bylaw or the October 10th a letter that we got from the Executive Office of Housing.
Not right now, no.
Again, yes, because we're gonna be, this meeting is going to be continued until October 24th, so I think we're interested in, board's gonna comment first, but we're also interested in the public's comments, and we'll try to flush out the issues and hopefully get meaningful responses, hopefully tonight, but if not tonight, over the course of the next few meetings. Perna?
Yeah, I had just one minor comment. On the state comment we received back, I believe it's either comment 3 or 2, site plan review related. Do you foresee that impacting our current site plan review process as much, or and consequently, if there's any need to change any of our rules on that part, or is it minor enough that it wouldn't impact us?
Yeah, so this comment kind of broadly applies to both the site plan references in our existing bylaw and in the proposed bylaw, which references the existing bylaw for the criteria. What I anticipate we'll be doing with town council is reviewing it for objectivity, similar to the parking requirement that uses that less defined term. This comment is really recommending that we just review that and make sure that it is more defined. They haven't cited any specific concern in there. I think this is just a general practice that they want us to review that. So we'll be doing that with town council to make sure that it's in accordance with existing case law.
But this assumes that the bylaw passes, and these are all allowed uses. And the way I've always viewed site plan review, and the way that I think our bylaw does, is that site plan review generally attaches to an allowed use, and that's how we regulate it. And I would hate to change what we've developed for site plan review, because, you know, the more significant issues are gonna be internal circulation, ingress and egress, and we wanna maintain some flexibility in our bylaws. We do it with other allowed uses, and I would hate to make them more liberal than they are now, and I don't think they're burdensome in particular. Now, I guess I would defer now to Julie. Any questions or comments?
Not right now.
Tim?
Yes, really building upon what Steve just mentioned, is with the recommendations that the EOHLC made based on, the pre-adoption review application, for items like number 4, is there any debate or leverage or conversations? I know you mentioned, Chris, town council hasn't weighed in on it yet, but if you change the definition of family in the bylaw, does that relate only to the new transit-oriented district in the proposal, or is that now town-wide? Because that would seem to be, a derogation of the existing bylaw, to me anyways. So I wonder if, and we know there's no opting out of this. It's not an option to say no. But if these are recommendations, could the town comply with some of the recommendations and then say to others, maybe the site plan review is one, maybe the family definition is another one? We have strong opinions about why that should remain the same. Does that make any sense?
It does, and I think really what both these comments of the definition of family and the site plan requirements kind of allude to is that, the state has been making very clear that beyond just compliance with the bylaw, they will be monitoring how communities enact and enforce the bylaw, and essentially how much discretion they use to limit development under this. What they don't want to see is boards that were using family as a discretionary tool to preclude development, which I know this board would not do.
Yeah.
And I think these comments are kind of alluding to that, and really just recommending best practices for updating our bylaws. As I noted, this definition of family is already obsolete, so it would be a cleanup item, I think. But in the meantime, we can exempt it in this bylaw, thereby ensuring there's certainly no conflict with the 3A.
And I think that, Tim, I know you come from the ZBA where you spent a significant amount of time dealing with in-law apartments. But the accessory use dwelling is kind of mooted.
Coming.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's kind of mooted, the need to meet the requirements of the in-law, by and large, depending on how large the unit is and where it is located. It kind of moots that section of our bylaw. And also, I think the definition of family, I think that Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, and I think our SJC has kind of doesn't like when towns or communities try to regulate, what is considered a family unit for the purposes of zoning or Board of Health or whatever. I guess was the case Griswold. I'd have to think when I went to law school and think about that, but I think that was one of the seminal cases. But I think that by and large, most of these comments, particularly, I'm not going to say I'm offended, but comment number 3 kind of contemplates a mixed-use development, and they didn't like our mixed-use development. So I find it kind of amusing that they're commenting on stuff that implicates a mixed-use development, off-street parking for visitors, employers. It kind of contemplates a retail or some other use, so. But I don't think any of these comments are insurmountable.
yeah, and it was just the language of, prohibits zoning from limiting or restricting the number of occupants per unit in the multifamily housing. So that's kind of open-ended. So there's no limit. So how would that be deemed as smart growth? That would be my only concern to that one.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Chris, Town of Milton is contesting the MBTA ruling. Where does that stand?
So they did have opening comments in front of the SJC. And to be clear on that, the Milton case is not contesting the validity of the 3A legislation. The real question is about the extent to which the AG's office can, and EOHLC can enforce the guidelines that are attached to that legislation.
And that's,
So it's currently in the court process now. Yep.
thank you.
Matt, I forgot, do you have any comments relative to the bylaw or the comments from the Livable Communities Division?
No, I did want to ask about, how's the town of Holden doing with it? I know they were also contesting it. Last I heard, it was, they didn't see themselves as an MBTA community. I haven't been able to follow up on how far Holden is with that yet.
Yeah, so Milton and Holden are the two non-compliant communities, and they remain in that status currently.
Kevin or Keith, I assume you're just observing?
For now.
Okay, thank you. So I guess my comments, because I know we've already gone through we went through the bylaw before, but my comments were have been by and large limited to what the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities had sent over. Again, I agree with Chris's characterization as to what the Milton case stands for. Hopefully the Milton case, the SJC comes down with a decision before town meeting. That would be helpful. And again, I don't think it's the validity of the bylaw that's in question. I think it's the enforcement mechanism and who can enforce the bylaw. So with that, As this board, and again, we're gonna consider this again a week from now, but I would open it up to the public for their comment. Anybody from the public would like to comment? Okay, Mr. Richards. If you could come up and identify yourself.
You already said my name. So
Well, no.
I know, no,
Okay,
Greg
begin
Richards,
with-
16 Hickory Drive.
Thank you.
I actually have a couple questions. I dug in deep on the bylaw here, so I have a couple questions. The first one, clarification, Chris, just because I'm confused about it. On that section 7, where there's that chart, and you have the minimum and maximum, you mentioned 2.5 stories max, but in that table it says 3. Is that just the way that they interpret 3 versus 2.5?
It does say 3 stories in that. I'll have to look back in the version that's posted on the website. We did
I think that's
adjust
where I
that
got that.
slightly from what was reviewed by EOHLC. I'll make sure that the correct version is up on the website, but
So that should be 2.5, or you think it's 2.5? Is that what you're saying?
I'll clarify that for the 24th.
Try to get you a definitive answer by the
Yeah,
next
yeah.
meeting.
And then, is the letter gonna be posted to the website too? The pre-adoption review letter?
I believe
Sorry?
it is.
Is the pre-adoption review letter gonna be posted to the website?
It's currently on.
It's
the
up there,
website.
okay, great, thank you. The other piece kind of goes back to, because I know from the beginning, we've really talked about controlling the number of units. I know that was a contentious point. That's about the 15 units per acre as a maximum, okay? Which is where we're basing the net potential new units on, is 15 units per acre based off the acreage, correct? So I guess, having said that, I guess my concern with the way the bylaw is written, in section 6, is that why are we allowing, let's say, this board, by a special permit, to exceed that? Because it says here that, a special permit by the planning board can allow greater than 15 units per acre is subject to special permit. So I know, in conversations I've had, that the way we were trying to write this bylaw to comply was, hey, let's try to control it the way we see fit. There's a lot of development in town, and a lot of residents have some concern about that. So, in my opinion, I guess, I'm just trying to understand, why are we allowing through special permit to exceed these maximum, which all this is based upon, as far as what we're articulating as net new units and so forth?
Sorry, and I do want to mention on the number of stories, I'll answer that question, but going back to that, I apologize, the number of stories is 3. I did misspeak in the presentation.
Okay.
What was submitted to EOHLC was the number of stories is 3. In the presentation, I noted 2.5, so the compliance model that we submitted, although the bylaw said 3, we had referenced in the compliance model 2.5 stories. So they reviewed it, and it's just
It's 3.
it's
Okay,
3,
all right.
yeah.
It's just-
So in terms of the special permit and allowing greater than 15 units per acre by special permit, that's traditionally, you can look at even the town center bylaw and how we handle unit counts there. Typically, what we've done in our proposals is set the cap where we can for by right uses, or where we find, in the case of the town center district, appropriate to be allowed by right. And then allow that special permit use for the board to consider projects at higher densities. What that does is it gives the flexibility for the community to evaluate through this process, through the planning board process, any project at higher densities if it's, if it meets the community needs, rather than completely precluding at that cap of units. So what it is, it's kind of like a minimum maximum, where we have up to 15 units per acre is the limited discretion of the board, and then the greatest discretion of the board is in considering any other proposal.
Well, I guess my concern with that tact, right, is just that when we're talking about, and we're gonna talk about the financial impact the number of net new students, and that's all based off a number. And I feel it's slightly disingenuous to say, well, this is what it is, however, the board can approve something. And now, that is up to the discretion of the appointed board, right? So it's, from a residential standpoint, I struggle to see why we were leaving that in there, because if it's really about compliance to a state mandate, why wouldn't we limit that and prevent some larger developments from coming in? Because we really don't know what those are gonna be. Because we've seen that there's other communities who've said, oh yeah, it's this maximum, and somebody comes in and they double it or whatnot. That's, from my standpoint, I think it's easier for the community to understand that without saying, oh, because if, let's just say in the future, right? A plan comes in front of the planning board and everybody thinks, oh, it's 15 units per acre. I thought that's what it was. Then all of a sudden a special permit's issued and people are like, wait a minute, I thought that's what we had agreed to. And I think that zoning is a little bit complicated when you go through it at town meeting, and I think for this particular bylaw, it seems we should try to make it as simple and straightforward, where if we're using numbers like 15, it should be 15. Not like, well, unless we decide otherwise later. That's my point on that.
So again, it's about giving the most amount of flexibility to the community to consider projects. So the way we have set it up is the site plan approval is at 15 units per acre, and that's the minimum that we can do in order to meet 3A compliance. We're giving the community the ability to evaluate projects, the flexibility to hear projects, but not necessarily approve them if it doesn't meet the community needs under those special permit provisions, which are much more, give significant more discretion to the board.
So, I guess, that's fair, I understand why you're saying it. I guess, from my perspective, let's say maybe somebody from the community, I would say, well, we should cap it and not allow it, because we don't know, right? And today, currently, we don't have the ability to elect the planning board. So the people who are on the planning board are appointed, right? So the community doesn't necessarily have control of that process today. That's my only point on that. So that's kind of it there. I will make a comment, I guess, just on the SJC case, because I did watch the hearing, and one of the things, to your point, they are really focused on is the guidelines, and the guidelines not going through a regulatory process, which typically requires a small business review and some more public hearings if there are truly regulations. So I think what the SJC really focused on there was, to your point, Milton wasn't arguing this whole piece. It was that it was clear to find by the legislature that just the grants would be the subject that were written in the legislation as a penalty, and nothing more, not the additional. So it seemed as though, at least when I listened to it, that the argument by Milton's attorneys and the way the SJC, the justices, were hearing it, I felt as though they were somewhat in support of Milton, saying there's a little bit of a discrepancy here between what's going on. So one other way I think other towns have done it is say, wait for that SJC case to be heard and then make a decision if you push something through to town meeting. Because in reality, let's say we don't put forth a compliant piece, you know, or we don't pass this at town meeting, or there's essentially what is really the penalty to to Shrewsbury, because if the Supreme Judicial Court comes back and says, no, everything is valid, or whatever they're hearing, whatever they may rule, you can always adjust at that time and say, okay, they've decided that everything's fine, then we have to become compliant, right? Because they're saying, right, in that particular case, is Milton's town charter, right, being ignored? Meaning, does it not matter? Because that's how I think a lot of people feel is, if it's a mandate, then why are we voting on it at town meeting? If we don't have the ability as communities to say no, right, then why are we even voting, right? They may ultimately decide that, but that, you know, from a town meeting member standpoint, I think that's a very valid reason to say, yeah, I would like to vote no. And if the SGC comes back and says, you know what, you don't have a choice, you have to put it in, so you put it in, right? But why go through that process to put it in? So that's my only comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sir, if you could come up and state your name and your address, where you live.
Hi, Dennis O'Connell, 48 Neptune Drive. just wanted some clarification on what this gentleman was saying. Is it required that we give that special permit to go over 15 houses? I think that could be, kind of devastating to the community. I mean, part of what this overlay does is you pick two places that are almost at 15 units per acre. No one's gonna wanna rebuild those, so we can kind of say those houses won't be, we're not gonna get those units built in addition. But if they could come in and say, I want a 3-story, 20 person per acre, and we give them a permit, then we're gonna get those houses, those extra houses built. So why would we give that?
So removing that provision would not affect compliance.
So why wouldn't we remove it, please?
So removing that provision wouldn't affect compliance. It would affect the ability of the community to hear projects at higher densities. So I'll be happy
But
to.
if we wanted to go higher densities, couldn't we bring it back on a warrant and change the bylaws later?
Yeah, I mean,
And then the community would be involved?
so to go to the, I mean, that would be the process. So if we take that provision out, if a project approached us, we would have to go to town meeting and secure town meeting approval to amend the bylaw again to put that back in. It's very unlikely that a project would stick around for doing that.
I think the way that I'm looking at this section is a developer comes in and says, I want to put a 8-story, 40 units per acre, 40B on X site.
Yeah.
And we say, well, we really don't like that. Have you considered and you're gonna have to build 25% of these units as affordable, and you're gonna have to do this, this, and this. It's kind of a negotiating tool with a prospective developer saying, have you considered doing this?
Have we ever had someone come in to ask that?
We haven't had this bylaw. We don't have this bylaw yet. It just gives us the town some flexibility in dealing with a potentially hostile 40B. That's how I view it.
But if we,
If you want to excise it and it doesn't affect the validity of the bylaw, if you wanted, I suppose we could consider that.
I'm just saying,
But
if we
I'm
put
not
that
asking
in
for a
there, we're
vote from
really
the
saying
audience.
we're willing to do more than 15. So,
But, there's some validity to your and Mr. Richards' point. I can see some validity, but
I think
can
it would
also
make it
see my,
easier for this, excuse me, go ahead.
I can also see my argument that you might want some flexibility.
And I agree with that, but I can see if we're gonna try to pass this at town meeting, it'd be much easier to not have that bylaw, have that in there. It'd be
Okay.
much more, we already heard 2.5 instead of 3. Now we're hearing, well, we're gonna put this bylaw in here so we can change it if the planning board agrees to it, which is not, as pointed out, a voted board. So my recommendation, which you'll hear in finance committee as well, is that we do not put that in there. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sir, if you just state your name and where you live.
Yeah, Rajesh Velagapudi at 355 Grafton Street, Precinct 10. So I definitely support Dennis' comment and the previous gentleman's comment that we already have a complicated bylaw that is pushed over us as a mandate. And then having that flexibility, we can always review that within the town framework. So I think it would be very helpful for the residents to have it straightforward, 15 units max. If it's more. The other question I have is the worst case scenario, if the bylaw doesn't pass, will it have an impact on Route 20 corridor improvement project that is currently in the development phase?
So if not the Route 20 improvement project, if we're rendered non-compliant, we would lose that 500,000. That would be no longer available to the community for the connector road, which is tied to those. I mean, it's a local piece that's in relation to the Route 20 improvements.
So Route 20 improvements should not have any impact one way or the other.
The Route 20 improvements are a state project, so that wouldn't. Yeah.
So with this now, I think I didn't check the final count on with the 3 floors and everything. What's the net new addition units that we are looking at?
The 924.
924?
Yep.
And do we have an updated numbers on what would be the cost impact on schools, services within the town?
Yeah, I can.
Any new additional CapEx investments that needs to be required due to these potential 950 units, not 920 units?
Yeah, I can pull that up. So the updated fiscal impact for the multifamily style development at 924 units would be a annual net revenue. So this is the full build out of the entire district at the maximum unit count as modeled by the compliance model. The annual net revenue estimate would be just shy of $950,000.
So that's mostly based on the revenue and the cost expense. But there is any anticipated, let's say we're reviewing the DPW upgrades, right? Is there any other avenues where we need to invest for CapEx?
Mr. Chairman, would you mind if I support this?
Sure, I would defer to the town manager, Mr. Mizikar, on that point, because I'm not as well versed on what the town's future capital needs are.
So whenever we look at town expenses, we think the areas that are most impacted by future development are education, police, and fire. It's not to say that we wouldn't need some additional services in other aspects of the organization, but they'll pale in comparison to these cost estimates that are up there. If you want to add 10%, to the number up there for other increases across the board, that could be fair. When we look at multifamily developments, where these are being proposed in mature infrastructure areas within the community, considering Route 9 and Route 20, we have sufficient water and sewer in there. So those costs, where they would have to be incurred would likely be incurred by the developer. We would maintain those, but our rates are sufficient to provide for the long-term reinvestment. So, again, good location when it comes to traffic, good location when it comes to water and sewer infrastructure that we have in the community. We have the capacities to be able to absorb that water and sewer. So if there's anything else in capital expenses that comes to your mind that I haven't addressed, I'm happy to think about those as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
And one thing, just to dovetail on that, if anybody in the interim has questions, why don't you type them out in advance and send them to Mr. McGoldrick, and he can circulate them to us, and we can try to have an answer for you of some sort at the next meeting. Sir? identify
Brian
yourself.
Costello, 398 Walnut Street. Referring to what Dennis and Greg brought up on section 6 about the special permit, you probably also want to look at section 5B because it's basically says the same thing. The following uses may be permitted in the TOD overlay district with issuance of a special permit. The special permit granting authority to use under the section shall be the planning board. Number 2 is vertical mixed-use developments which include in total greater than 15 residential units per gross area, which is basically the same thing
Yeah.
as 6.
That's fine.
It's saying that the So if we're gonna strike that language in 6, we probably would want to strike that language in 5.
Fair point.
Just a minor point. I'd support what other people said on the greater density and the fact that we probably don't want the planning board having that special permit. I just want to make comment that there are 19 towns that have actually, I know there's only a couple towns not in compliance, but 19 towns have actually voted against it and will not be in compliance, right? We have till December 31st, but they will absolutely not be in compliance because town meeting voted against it. There's also, I want to say 20 or 30 other towns that are voting in the next couple of weeks. So that number is going to increase. 120 towns, representatives of towns, filed in the amicus brief in favor of Milton's arguments at the SJC. So this isn't a small group. This is a fairly large group of people who are saying, we're not really comfortable with this mandate from the state. And so I think just my comment, others have already said it, I don't think it would be a bad thing to say, can we put on the brakes and wait to see what the SJC said? I watched the whole thing. It actually was pretty interesting. There were some really very strong comments to the state on, can you enforce these guidelines, right? That was again, they didn't say that the law was necessarily out of line, but they did say the implementation of the fines or the penalty, right, was very, very negligible. Because the legislature said it was 4 things and the guidelines say it's many, many more. Milton did make an argument, and it's highly likely obviously if the FJC rules that the guidelines are not in force, that seawall grant will come back to Milton because that was outside of the original, penalty, which was meant to be pretty small. So I would just ask, can we consider just waiting? There's, plenty of towns that are doing it. And because of the nature of this, law where it is a mandate that does impact towns, we're not a tiny town anymore by any stretch of the imagination, but we've got a lot of, density, and it would be great to wait and see before we are kind of forced into a situation where this stuff would happen. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Sir?
Charles Garabedian, Precinct 2. A couple of things on assuming what this law is about that bothers me. I thought about it long and hard. MBTA, is it Metropolitan Boston Transit Authority?
Massachusetts.
Apparently they want to increase ridership on the rail line from Worcester into Boston and back. For that to occur, we would want people moving into this housing that would be going into Boston on a regular basis. And I haven't seen any numbers from anybody saying, what do you think is going to happen? So we'd flip a coin on that. So we'd have a probability of a half, say, and that's being generous, that we have a probability of 1/2 that anybody moving into that complex would be having to go into Boston on a regular basis. That's event number 1. Event number 2 is...
Is this a question, or is this your statistical analysis? About 40 years ago, I thought I wanted to be an actuary, and I heard this presentation before, and I decided I didn't want to be an actuary, but I heard your statistical analysis. If you have a question rather than a presentation...
I thought we could come here to
No,
make comments.
but it's a question, General. I heard this before.
You did, but maybe some other people didn't.
But you have if you could,
Is this a
Mr.
public-
Garabedian, I don't mean to be disrespectful,
No, I know that. I'm not
but
saying
if
that.
you could phrase it in terms of a question,
Well-
it's not really a question.
Is-
I know you're a professor, and you're kind of like, this is your course syllabus to us, but if you could phrase it in terms of a question, we'll try to get you some answers.
I'm just trying to make people aware of a danger as that I see a lurking danger. Now, if I don't
Okay.
have the right to say that. I will sit down.
No, you absolutely have the right to say it,
Don't
but
let me
you
say it.
but you're making it in terms of a presentation to us. We're looking to
It's-
get you information,
It is a
okay, and the rest of the people
concern
information.
that I would share with people in terms of how to vote and in terms of what the direction of this town is going to be in relationship to this issue.
So I'm not telling you how to make your presentation, but if at the end of it, you want to say, okay, look at these assumptions, can you tell me if any of these assumptions were considered when presumably the legislature, which we didn't vote on, this board didn't vote on this, but
I don't-
if you can phrase it in terms of a question.
I don't have a question. I just want, I'm sharing some information with
Okay,
you.
continue.
and with-
I don't mean
Oh, that's
to be,
okay.
I don't mean to be disruptive, but it's, usually we're looking for questions.
Right.
And you want to make a comment, that's great, but.
I thought this, if this was
No,
a place for
it
comment, I
is,
wouldn't have come here.
it is, but, and I'm not faulting you, and I understand where you're coming from.
Right.
And I hate to interrupt you, but,
That's okay.
but continue. But if you can make it brief, because your last one wasn't brief.
Well, I was interrupted last time. I asked a question, and if you remember, that question took 8 minutes, and the question wasn't answered, and my time was.
Did I interrupt you?
No, you didn't.
No, I didn't. This is a meeting, you don't get to interject, okay? This is Mr. Garabedian and I. You'll have plenty of time to make your comments. You'll have plenty of time to make your comments, okay? You can be next, if you want, after Mr. Garabedian. I'm sorry, Mr.
Okay.
Garabedian, continue.
So we've gone back, I think we've established what event number one is, and that is a person moving into this complex that's going to be going to Boston on a regular basis. Event number two is, how is he going to get there? Well, he's either going to commute, carpool, take a bus, or take the train. We don't know what that probability is, so I'm being generous, and I would say it's a half. So I come up with the fact that the probability of this bill being successful in terms of getting people on the train every day so that the ridership and the revenue to MBTA will increase is 25%. I don't think that's a good investment, and I don't think it's a good direction or time to go in. All right. Number two, on the assumption that this bill is not for the MBTA, but it's for some other reason to maybe attract people out of the Boston area just to live in the suburbs, then the bill is definitely discretionary. Because what they are doing is they're just picking on certain towns and saying, you people have to make sure that this occurs. Which leads me to the fact that I think we're going to end up with perhaps increased pressure on our town budget. No matter what those numbers say, I've heard this before in the past, and before I know it, 2 or 3 years down the line, our tax rate goes up. So I'm concerned about the impact it's going to have on schools. I'm concerned on the impact it's going to have on the police department, on the fire department, emergency response, water, and sewer. Now, they tell us that we have plenty of water, but we're still rationing water every summer. And I do that very faithfully. I have no problem with that. But I'm just saying, these are concerns that I have as a citizen. And my third concern is that the state is mandating this, but nowhere do I see in their communication with us as community. They're supposed to be taking care of us. Where have they got any kind of a guarantee that if we get into any kind of financial difficulty, that they will give us a certain amount of money to help us out? I rest my case. I have nothing else to say on that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Any further comments, questions? Sure, come up, Mr. Richards.
I wasn't going to talk about this. Greg Richards again. The finance, because you brought it up. So I do have a question. I think, according to the last time that was run, the assumption is the 924 total units with 407 net new school children. So my question is, where does the $4,486 per pupil number come from? Because obviously the school committee says it's over $17,500 per student. If you look at an analysis which I put together, which I'd be happy to share, using RKG, which we used for the economic feasibility analysis, and if you use it, their fiscal analysis they do for other towns, I get a cost per pupil of like $11,500. So I really struggle to understand how it can only be $4,486 for a school child. That number, I don't know where it comes from.
Would you like me to respond? Sure. So, working directly with the school department and understanding how they approach this is where that number comes from. So we looked at cohorts of students in groups of 25 based upon our current school layout. So we have, as you know,
Yeah.
kindergarten through 4, the middle school, and then the high school. So whenever we took that 407 number, we divided it up into those groups, right? So anytime we'd have more than 25 students at a cohort, we applied 2 teachers at $130,000. We applied 1 bus at $90,000, and we applied educational materials at $30,000, okay, to cover those costs. Because while I understand the tendency and the interest in using the per pupil expenditure, and I know you aren't, you're using slightly lower
Yeah,
number.
yep.
But that's how that figure was derived. It's, you know, taking the 407, looking at the impact, not on a per child basis, but again, in groups of 25 per cohort, and trying to estimate. Of course, you know, the next student through the door doesn't necessarily cost the district the new per pupil expenditure. It could cost, admittedly,
More.
$350,000 more,
Exactly.
right? Or it could cost, honestly, you know, with the student with, you know, average needs, much less than the per pupil that's in place right now.
But we don't know, right? Because it's just like when you had the homeless students cost you over $20,000 per pupil. We weren't even reimbursed fully from the state.
I'm not familiar with the 20 people.
Well, if you take $104 per day with the student, if you go back and look at the report from, is it 2020, it was a couple years ago that.
That's our revenue figure, just to be clear. That's what we
Yeah,
receive from the state.
but-
That's not what it
But
costs us.
but yes, I understand where you're going, but in that report, which the school committee put together, actually said that they needed additional incremental funds to cover those costs. Because if that $20,000 is not $104 a day, right? If you actually multiply that out, it's less. We needed to spend an additional $500,000 that Shrewsbury Public Schools paid for to cover those costs. Because, to your point, you don't know where those students come from. There's a lot of English as a second language. There's additional busing where it could be a lot more. So I struggle, and like I said, I would always, you know, default, say, okay, fine, let's go to a consultant, right, who does this type of work and looks at it. Because we did the same for Edgemere, right? When we built Edgemere, we did a feasibility study which has cost per pupil in it, right? And at the time, it was like, say, $10,000 because it was, you know, 2016. But if you would look and you said, look at other towns even on MBTA. Milton actually did one, there's a bunch. And if you look at the model RKG does, I don't think people argue it because they're using it to make decisions. So I just feel that we're trying to make this look better, right? So that we don't have people saying, actually, I think this is gonna cost us. Because if we use my figure, we're losing nearly $2 million a year, right? We have tax revenue of 3.2 million, it costs us 5.1. Most of that is educational, 4.7 million, right? So I would at least like, and maybe you can provide it, to know those school committee numbers, because I believe in this particular case, I think we're underselling what the true cost of the education is, because we don't know, to your point. We're looking at 25 unit cohorts. We're talking about 407 students, right? And if those all do break in Route 20 right there, I don't know what district that's in. I don't know if that's Floral, I don't know where elementary school
9.
it is.
It's District 9.
Well, I don't know what school they go to. That's what, if they, in that district, what elementary school they would go to. I just don't know. So I don't know if they're all elementary school age kids. Could we hope 407 new students in one of our elementary students? So that's my struggle.
But maybe it would be helpful, you know, it'd be helpful if we knew how many school age, just to answer your
Yeah.
point. I don't think that if you looked at how many school age children are at Edgemere Crossing, you looked how many are at the Quinn, because I don't think they're gonna be in the older legacy apartment complexes like the Shrewsbury Commons or Ashford Crossing. I think if you look at the newer ones, and maybe the one that Avalon built on Route 20, how many school age kids, I think that would give you an idea as to how many kids you could expect from these newer.
There is a difference, though.
Yeah.
Let me just tell that, you can go back. The difference is the size of the unit. Because in those developments, there's a lot of studios and one-bedrooms. But with the way that the overlay district is not to limit the size of the unit. So could feasibly build larger units. So you don't know,
A
right?
developer is gonna be very hesitant to build a 3-bedroom unit. I can tell you that.
They're building a lot of them on 40B and Green Street, aren't they? I mean, there's a lot of higher density.
Because they're required to. The DHCD is requiring them to.
So
I don't think we're required.
I don't know if we can, and if you want to do it, but I'm just saying, I think, even in that case, let's just say that, so that's two numbers we're talking
So
about.
go look at
Even
the
if your
two
number
units.
shrank, right, what is the incremental cost per pupil? That's still the original question.
Okay, but I think we can kind of quantify that, but let's see what the projected raw number of school children are, because, and I think if we had that information, then we can argue about what the delta is on the cost.
So it's 407, that is the projected number
I
provided.
get it, but let's look at, I think that there was some question as to whether you thought, or other members of the audience thought that was an undercount.
Right. If I
I'm
could
just going with
I
the
could-
number.
Yeah, yeah.
I
I'm sorry,
respond?
yeah.
No, that's fine. So, I just want to be really clear. I'm not trying to make numbers look good. I'm
Yeah.
trying to use the best data that we have, right? And so and I respect what you're saying,
Sure.
Mr. Richards, with having RKG come in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in this instance, we have better data than RKG, right? And I know RKG did Edgemere. Do you know how many, and if you don't, no worries. Like, do you know how many students that they projected in Edgemere? Because I know that we actually have 20, right? So we have 0.19
Yeah.
students per apartment dwelling that's there. The number that we're using, 407, we're using the highest density multifamily complex that we have in Shrewsbury, which is Audubon, and that's 0.44. The average across all of our apartment complexes is 0.1927 school-age children per unit. That includes Madison Place, Audubon, Shrewsbury, Quinn 35, Edgemere Crossing. So I'm not trying to make this look better. I'm trying to provide the best data that we can based on what we have. And when I can walk down the hall and talk to the, Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Administration, I trust him much more than I trust RKG, right? They're using a broad set of data. It's applicable in some ways, right?
Yeah.
I understand it, but I think because we've been so hyper-focused in this community on things like school-age children in apartments, like we have the data right in front of us, so let's use it.
Yeah, and even if, say, the number changed, I still think there's two numbers, right? So we can debate, right, the number of children per unit, right? Say the number's less. But I still think that cost per pupil is important as well, about where they're coming up with that. Because, like I said, if you looked at the most recent, say, cohort to come in, when you look at Worcester City Motel, Days Inn, the cost even though I know we were reimbursed from the state, if you really look at what the cost was, if there are students who come in, like, into these units, I just think that $4,400 number, to me, seems a little, so that was just
I
one
mean,
thing.
I would
That's
say
all.
that looking at an apartment complex like Edgemere Crossing or Quid 35 is a much more representative data set than migrant families in a shelter.
Yeah, no, fair, but I'm just saying, it's comparing and contrasting, that's all.
We're good.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else have any questions, comments? Mr. O'Connell, I'll let you go next. This woman hasn't had a chance to comment.
Hi, Carissa Ford. I'm a town meeting member for Precinct 3. I've gone back and forth on this, as I'm sure a lot of you have as well. I think it's a obviously divisive issue. And I appreciate all the information we've been getting. I feel like I've been learning a lot through trying to follow this process. As somebody who's in my 30s, there's a part of me that so desperately wants more housing options because a lot of my friends anecdotally can't buy anywhere. Even if they work in Boston, they can't buy in Boston. So there's a huge issue with my generation. That is like, where are we supposed to live and where are we supposed to start a family and all of that? And Shrewsbury is a great town to do that. I also have heard from people in my precinct who are very concerned, and so I feel obligated to share that as well. Just like other people have said, concerned about the school, concerned about taxes. So I don't want to repeat everything that you guys have heard, because I think it's all been said, we've heard a lot. So my question, and I'm so sorry if I'm asking a question that's been asked in the past, what is the time frame from, if we pass this at town meeting, when do you think we'd actually then have people living in this area? And that was 407 kids. Because in some ways I feel like we're talking like it would happen overnight. Obviously that's not true. So what is the estimate from when this would pass to when potentially suddenly we'd have all these
Well, the Attorney
spaces and
General,
people?
the Attorney General would have to review the bylaw and see that it was compliant with what the statute was. And assuming that by the time that the AG, there may be questions back and forth, assuming maybe 6 months from the time the town meeting passes assuming town meeting does pass the warrant article, 6 months before the bylaw becomes effective based on the back and forth between the town and the Attorney General's office, then you'd have to get a proposal, and it would probably, if someone was gonna build a 300-unit apartment complex, it would probably take 6-9 months between engineering, architecturals, whatever, such that they'd be in a position, and all the other experts they needed, so that they'd be in a position, probably 9 months, maybe a year, they're in a position to make a submission to the town, as well as whoever else they have to make a submission to, Mass Highway, for a project, and then, it would, even though some of these things are as of right, they still subject to site plan review. I would imagine it would be several months between planning, conservation, town's review, water and sewer, Mass Highway, because these are all built on, are gonna be where we've placed them, are all on state highways. Probably take a year, at least, a year and a half to get approvals. And then construction, but I don't think that the absorption rate at this point, I'm not sure that all these units, 900 units, could be absorbed in Shrewsbury over a 5-year period. I'm guessing 10, 15, 20 years. And some of these sites that have been designated have challenges. And it kind of goes back to what I said before, is I'd rather the town pick the site, that designate the area that is going to be where the overlay is, than some land court judge in Boston or some functionary that they appoint, like a receiver or something. I guess I kind of view this as like almost, I know that people have focused on what the penalty is, and it's good that the SJC says all you're gonna, if this gets voted down, all you're gonna lose is your grants. But I'm concerned about additional enforcement mechanisms, like a judge, almost like a voting rights case, where a judge says, no, this is where we're gonna put it, town. We don't like where you put it because of the wetlands, the slopes, we want, the other challenges. We want a place that we think that it's more likely, I'm not saying, has less challenges to build than the sites you've designated. So I'd rather the locals make the decision than somebody in Boston. That's my thought.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
I think that was a great response. I just want to provide a slightly more direct response to the question as well, kind of summarizing that, and I just want to bring this slide back up. So I want to be very clear that what town meeting is voting on is the legislation. It does not create units, and there is no mandate to actually construct those units. So I just want to be very clear with the community on expectations, whether this is passed or whether this is not passed. any project that comes under this legislation would require board approval, which I think you outlined very well in the timeline of what that would be. It includes public notice and the public process, similar to what we're doing here tonight. But I also want to be very clear that with or without this zoning, we do have in this area, and we've done this fairly deliberately, we are overlaying where there is existing units, where there are approved units, or where new units are potentially being proposed. And so that 40B process precludes zoning, so those units would be constructed, the approved units certainly will be constructed regardless of what town meeting votes on. And the proposed units will go through a similar process with the Zoning Board of Appeals. The existing units, again, showing how we've really kind of limited the net new units on the site, that Shrewsbury Commons, under the modeled capacity, would only be able to construct 6 new units in that area. So I just want to be clear in terms of what the community can expect with passing or not passing this zoning. It's that it doesn't create the units. That's on private development to propose. And there's different avenues for them to do that, so.
Great, thank you.
And it
Both
may
very
be-
clear explanations. Just one other comment. I would like to publicly say I support removing the special permits part. That was the only piece that really bothered me, so I also make that suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments? I think Mr. O'Connell wanted to go next. Yeah, didn't you?
Yeah, I thought you said Mr. O'Connell.
I'm sorry, I thought you were, I'm sorry. Ah, I'm confused. It hasn't been a long night.
Tony Bonaventura,
Yeah.
120 Howard Ave. So I'd like, if you don't mind, to touch on a lot of the items that were brought up and just expand a little bit, because I think it's really important to the process. So I'm going to start off with something that I believe is still a major issue for all of you to make a decision on, and that's the number, the cost of, whether it's these or any other housing units in town, and the cost of students, because it is one of the major costs in any residential, obviously, any residential project. So there was a lot of back and forth about the cost, and if I can just say, in my life experience, in any organizational structure, the higher up you go, the simpler things get, and I think that's what this needs to be, is simplified. We're doing projection of cost. I don't think that it's prudent to get into the weeds. There was a talk about 25 students of 20, cohorts of 25, and what happens when the next one comes in, and that all boils down to averages. By definition, that's why we use that averages. And we have good data in town. We have a school budget. We know what it costs. So my question would be, I guess, if I can through you to the town manager, is how much did the last 200, we'll take half of what we're projecting, how much was the average of the last 200 students that we educated in the town of Shrewsbury?
Per project?
No, forget about projects, really doesn't matter. Doesn't matter where they come from. We're not talking about how many are gonna be in there, that's irrelevant right now. We're trying to zone in on an important number. We've gone to this point where we're reshaping the average cost per pupil in the town of Shrewsbury. And I think that whole discussion is, in all due respect to everybody involved, absurd when you're looking at the amount of students we're looking at. So we have data. We have students in the town of Shrewsbury right now. Doesn't matter where they came from, the last 200 students, how much was the average cost per student?
So that would be, for the sake of ease, and I'm not sure the town has that breakdown, but I guess for the sake of ease, it would be the first grade class of Spring Street, grade class of Coolidge, first grade class of Patton.
Is it really? I don't know. I'm
I don't know,
assuming
but, you
people
know,
move
I
into
don't know how-
town
I don't know
with
how you
students
do
of all
that.
I'm assuming people move into town with students of all ages.
Yeah, but I don't know how the town would segregate, would have that data to say.
We've been processing it for years, and we have data. We have a school budget that was presented at the town meeting just a few months ago. And I looked at that budget, and nowhere in that budget, line by line, item by item, there's no place in that budget that parses out the cost of students by cohorts, where they came from, how much they cost. It's kind of like, I feel, it's hard to even have this discussion, but I feel like you're talking about the average cost of a tank of gas if you go on a trip. You can't take the cost of gas going down a hill and forget about the fact that you have to go up a hill. And that's what that cohort discussion is all about. Yeah, sure, you can say, yep, we might get lucky and 25 students will come in and we can spread them out because we're a little fat right now on our teachers. We have a little space in the classes. What happens when those 25 come in right after that and all the classes are a little tight and you have to hire 5 teachers? And that's what creates, by definition, an average. And it's what we've always used in this town. And
So you're looking for the
I'm
gross.
upset about the fact that we have to talk about this because I don't think it's fair to the discussion. And here we are, 1 week away, or 1 meeting away from you guys making a recommendation, and we're still talking about this,
Okay.
when we have simple numbers.
Right, so you're looking for the gross number of what it costs to educate the last 200 kids in the door at, in the Shrewsbury Public.
Or the average cost per student, which is what we don't know, you don't know, you just said it yourself. We don't know
correct.
what year they're gonna come in,
And you
we
just
don't
let-
know what grade they're gonna come in, we don't know if it's 100 at a time, 200 at a
Mr.
time, or
Bonaventura.
5 at a time.
I'm a little confused, and I think the town manager wants a little clarity as to.
Can you define what the last 200 students means?
I'll
Because
take it in many
if
different ways
If
if
I
you
look
want.
at the student enrollment in the Shrewsbury Public Schools in 2011, there was 5,940 students. The enrollment in the 2023-2024 school year is 5,921 students. So I don't know, so over the last 10 years, we're pretty much as that middle ground, not going up the hill or going down the hill on your road trip. So what 200 students do you want me to look at?
The point of my road trip was trying to parse out what each of those students cost.
Okay,
That's
so
what we've
Forget
gotten
about the
into.
road trip. So what are how do I define the last 200 students from your comment?
You can define, you can pick 200 students out of any of those years from any segment you want. I don't really care, and give us an average. And I think we already have that average. We have a better average. We have an average of 6,000 students, or roughly 6,000 students.
And I'll stop.
That
But
actually helps the average,
the-
I think.
So the next student that walks in the door, a student walks to school administration, they enroll tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
That student is not gonna cost the average per pupil.
But when you include that student in the average per pupil, what that one student, you say it doesn't cost us anything, correct?
It reduce, yeah, could reduce it, could increase it.
Well, if you don't have to hire anybody else, correct? That's the assumption that the next student that walks in, there's a space in class, you don't have to hire. Right now, we have a ratio of 1 employee, entire school system, according to the town meeting. For every 1 employee, there are 6 students. That was the number that was given at town meeting, right? So if 6 students come in at some point, maybe you can get by, you can get to 8. But on average, if you get to 12, 18, you're gonna need somewhere in there another employee. Those are the averages. That's how we budget.
I mean,
We don't know when these students are gonna come in or where. Impossible.
I mean, I can run the average, I think anyone can run the average.
Right.
Right, and use that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the best number to use.
But I don't think you've given us a good explanation
Well,
of how and why.
Okay, that's fair.
Kevin, you think we can run the average and
Sure.
have it available at the next
Absolutely.
meeting?
Yep.
Yeah. But I'd like to know how you feel about that, or how the finance committee feels about that in budgeting. I'm
We have a
astounded by this, actually.
Finance Committee has a hearing on November 7th, you could ask them.
Yeah. But how do they make a decision on this? If we're correct in looking at this, like we always have in the entire history of Shrewsbury, the average cost per student, because we're going to have varying
students coming in of varying, I don't even care about it, it's just the average student. Well,
Okay.
maybe there's some students that cost more, some cost less. I don't care about any of that. In the end, you end up with an average. That's how we do budgets. That's how we project, because it's impossible for you or anybody, let me ask that question. Is it possible for us right now, as we sit here today, if this plan gets approved, to say when, where, and how many students are gonna come into the town of Shrewsbury?
You don't know, because you don't know. It's all a projection, just like everything else we do. That's why that, in conjunction with some of these projects, there's a financial impact report.
Right.
It's all projection, just like stormwater and everything else.
Which is why we use averages, because it's impossible
Well,
for what's been presented
Okay.
for us to occur.
Your question's been asked, we'll try to get you an answer, Mr. Bonaventura.
Okay.
That's all we can do.
Okay.
Right.
I was hoping that I would get some feedback of your, where you stand on this, because I haven't heard anything from.
I'm not sure I understand your question. That's why I want to see Kevin's answer.
It's a basic question about should we use averages, or should we try to make up a hypothetical maybe?
Well, I think that,
Is that,
I think that the town has presented what the financial, the current financial costs are based on the data they have. And from that, they've looked at what the potential new number of students in these 900 units are, and then looked at other offsetting factors, including the revenue generated from the project. I don't,
But if I can answer that, revenue is highly dependent on, when we look at residential, it's highly dependent on, the most expensive cost, I think we all agree, is education.
that's not a revenue, that's an expense.
Right, the expense, yes.
Okay, so
Sorry,
let me see the data that the town manager produces, and maybe we'll have some further thoughts on it.
Okay, it's, I'm sorry to be
You're not.
excited about that, but it's extremely frustrating at this point in the process, after all of these years, to get into spend so much time on that issue instead of just putting it out there as it is and how it's always been. I respect the fact of, trying to drill down on the numbers in apartments versus residential. That's a very, very valid point, and trying to understand that is very helpful and critical. But, when we get into this student part, I'm really concerned about that, and I'm surprised that there aren't other folks on town boards that aren't concerned about that. That worries me as a resident, and I think that every resident in the town of Shrewsbury should be extremely concerned with that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I have some other thoughts. I'm sorry, but that
Okay.
came up, and it's very important.
All right, maybe, can we
I'll
put
try
a little
and,
bit more
I will,
succinctly?
honestly, I would love to take this behind.
You can't, though, you can't, so.
Go into that office or somebody's office, but I do think it's very important for the town to hear these
All right,
discussions.
so let's continue.
Okay, so, I also concur with the thought of, and I haven't heard feedback on it, what's the downside if we don't comply? Because I've looked at it, and they don't really, other than grants, they don't really talk about a downside. The idea of this is supposed to be compassionate, create less expensive housing. I question a lot of that, we don't need to talk about that. But if, from the state, this is a compassionate project, and we're trying to create affordable, hopefully lower the cost of housing, theoretically, if we don't comply, there's nothing in the current bill other than grants, which would be nothing if it's next year that, we're forced to comply by some reason. Do we think that they're gonna say, no, you didn't comply back then, so now you can't be part of this? And I can't imagine that could ever happen. Is there a thought on that?
Mr. Chair, can I, to your point, if, take that as a, switch that, right? So if we are to adopt this.
Yep.
And then the SJC comes back and rules in favor of Milton. And perhaps then we come back to town meeting and say, we're going to remove this overlay district. We would, we have now gone from this town meeting, this November town meeting, through, we don't lose any grants at that point, right? Versus taking us out of the running for those grants. I would rather personally be in the running for those grants than being taken off the table for those grants, right?
So, and that's why this other piece of information that I think should have, needs to be solved ASAP is critical, because the discussion about whatever the number is, $200,000 in maybe grants that we get, may be far outweighed by the negative. And I believe the numbers will show that, not changing the amount of number of students projected, but the actual cost, because I believe they're way off. And I actually think that when you project, you should always project conservatively. I don't know who's ever done a project. I think we're actually forced to project conservatively when we build buildings in the town. If I'm not mistaken, that we're required to have an overrun budget. Isn't that true?
All right,
So I don't think I'm out of line with the thought process.
I don't think you're out of line, but it's kind of, at this point, let's focus. So you've asked us why not defer, okay? And I think Ms. Olson has answered that question. Again, and, maybe you're right. Maybe the town, maybe the SJC sides with the town of Milton. But that's certainly not gonna preclude the legislature from amending this legislation to provide for a remedy.
And that's very possible, and that's why I believe it's more important, and that brings us to the bigger look at this. There is a time, as a town, that we should show what our intentions are, and this, to me, is the perfect opportunity to try and hold on to some of our autonomy as a town. The people ultimately do that, whether it's at the voting box or as a group of towns. It's very important in any democracy to try and do that. This is an easy time, in my opinion, to do that.
Right. We're kind of far afield at this point.
Right, but I think it's
Do you
important.
have any other specific questions, Mr. Bonaventura?
I have a lot, but I don't feel like this is probably the time to discuss them.
But if you have some, because, you're bringing things up, and I respect that, but if you have some and you want to formulate some questions, and you can send them to,
Planning at shrewsbury.ma.gov.
we may be able to give you some better answers.
Well, I'll ask a question that's specific to the planning board. So what do you feel like you're looking at when you make your ultimately, you're gonna make a recommendation on this, I assume, to the town meeting?
Correct.
That's kind of your role. So are you looking at this just at the, which is the best plan, and you're not looking at other aspects that we just discussed? The other aspects meaning if we didn't do it at all. Are you considering that in your
Sure,
recommendation?
of course. Anytime that we consider a warrant article, we make a decision as to whether we recommend or not recommend the warrant article to town meeting.
Okay, so you look at the whole picture.
Correct.
So I would just like to ask this question then. So if it weren't for the state regulating this new zoning or mandating this new zoning potentially, would all or some of you advise the town that this would be a good zoning option to adopt? Could you weigh in on that at
Mr.
some
Chair.
point?
It's kind of
Deliberation?
speculative.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah,
If I may, I want to go back to some of my opening comments on this, and speak to what the objective that we are suggesting for the planning board to vote on October 24th. The objective that our office sees as this proposal is to put an article that can reasonably be determined to comply with 3A to town meeting floor for a vote. And that is the objective, full stop.
right.
Do you agree with that?
I do.
That's not, I don't believe that's what you just said.
So,
You know what? I think it is. I said that we either we determine all zoning articles or warrant articles that we're asked to pass upon, and we look at whether a variety of considerations as to whether we recommend or not recommend to town meeting. But again, I think Mr. McGoldrick's point is well taken. He's correct that this has been mandated by the state, and we're gonna take it up. So that's what we're doing, we're taking it up. What happens at town meeting, happens at town meeting.
It's,
Won't be the first time, if we recommend or don't recommend, it won't be the first time that town meeting has disagreed with us. Thank you.
I'll leave it at that, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have any other questions? Come up. Come on back.
Hi there, good evening.
Hi.
Krista Dupre, 14 Candlewood Way. I echo many sentiments that were already stated tonight. I am also a town meeting member, and have watched and learned a lot along the way with this zoning. Clarifications for myself and maybe for the public is, people seem to get confused. They hear of 3A, the MBTA, but also 40B. So I'm looking for clarification, even for myself, and things get a little muddied of what it is and isn't, because I hate to use the word misinformation, but I do hear a lot of different words being used and moved into the word, the MBTA 3A. Thank you.
40B is a statute that Massachusetts adopted, I think,
Yep.
close to 50 years ago, which kind of provides a carrot and a stick for towns to provide affordable housing. Okay, that's in place. It is not a town regulation, although the town does have some regulations about how to file a 40B, but that goes to the zoning board. This 3A is a zoning article which we are considering and has not been adopted. That's the difference.
Right. So my clarification, hopefully even for myself, I understand the zoning article, and that's the focus of tonight.
Right.
But in this particular article, because I haven't gone down into all the weeds, there is no component for affordable housing in this. Is that correct?
That's incorrect. We have
Okay.
the affordability component listed at 15%, which is the maximum that our economic feasibility analysis that we conducted would allow to render a project built under this financially feasible. So we're requiring the maximum amount of affordability that we can.
So that would be a requirement for any builder that would come in and build, obviously, site plans, et cetera, the proper process. They would then have to be required to include that affordability. Is that correct?
Correct, 15% or more.
And 25% for a 40B, for a multifamily 40B.
Right. My understanding, and again, not to muddy the waters, but in a 40B, my understanding is there is a provision that they can not have an affordable housing and do a portion payout. I don't know what the proper terminology is. Could you?
No, so I think what that is likely is a misunderstanding. So
Okay.
our local bylaw allows a fee in lieu, where a developer can pay a fee to the Affordable Housing Trust in lieu of units. 40B it requires the affordable housing. So that's it. Yeah.
So that would not be a way in this new zoning of how it would be adopted here in town.
So we do still have in our inclusionary bylaw a fee in lieu of units on the books. I know the board has a number of times looked at removing that provision. I also, on the last project that came before the board, there was a denial of the fee in lieu units. So it is a special permit process, and the board can deny the fee in lieu. I believe I just want to make sure I'm clear. We were looking at exempting this from the fee in lieu to require the 15 outright. I just want to make sure that I'm correct in that prior to making that assertion. we were looking at that. I don't know, I don't remember if we actually wrote that exemption in, that it's the 15 required full stop, or if it referenced the inclusionary bylaw, which would allow a special permit for fee and lieu.
Okay. I
I'll
think
have that answer for the 24th.
that's where I get confused, because you hear bits and pieces along the way, so I appreciate the explanation. Where does this fit in, if passed by town meeting, with our housing production plan, for these types of buildings? That's what I'm curious on. I know
So-
that's sidetracked, sorry, Jared,
just-
of
yeah,
the
that's fine.
building, but just curious of hearing some lots may not be buildable, and there could be some challenges with wetlands and so forth, yeah.
So,
you, Chair.
so again, to be clear, the bylaw would not require units to be generated. A project, as we discussed, that's developed under these regulations would require 15 units, or 15% of units to be designated as affordable, at 80% AMI. What that would do is those 15% of units would be eligible for our subsidized housing inventory. And then depends upon rental or condo, but we're not over that 20%, so, actually, sorry, it doesn't matter, rental or condo in this case.
But unlike a 40B, all those units wouldn't count.
Correct. And a 40B, they're over the 20%, so all of the units in a 40B.
All the units affordable,
Including the
not
market rate.
affordable count towards our,
They do count,
towards the 10%, yeah.
they do count. And our count is currently, I'm just curious.
7.
It's, so it's currently listed at 6.1%. We're filing a request for new units for projects that are now eligible to get on there, which I believe brings us to I'll get the exact number, it's 7.1 or 7.3%.
Okay. And I'm just curious more of, Chair, if I may, of the balance of, with this housing production plan, of the buildable lots in town, of like, what's really left? I mean, hearing of the balance of trying to get to 10%, because what happens when everything's built? Where are you gonna get the 10%? I don't know.
Yeah, so at full build-out, as we projected this, and again, I'm not sure if that's feasible, but that 924 units, if that was done, that would put us well over our 10%. We would achieve it.
Okay.
And it won't shock me if you see repurposing of retail office
Yes.
space in the town.
Yes, which is what I have seen and heard of.
Yeah.
Exactly. Again, I echo the concerns of police, fire, schools, 100%. I personally, and still, I do struggle with this, but I do very much feel this is an unfunded mandate, and I would want all zoning, just like you said, Chair, a local decision. That's what I prefer, not coming from the state, so, thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Gentleman in the back, you have not spoken yet, correct? I'll take you next, sir.
Thank you. I am Raju Palapati, Precinct 4, 124 Memorial Drive. I'm also a town meeting member, so I have a few questions from my constituents. They have only one particular question that came to me recently, because there was a mention about misinformation out there. So my question to the gentleman here is, are you informed about the worst case scenario before you take a decision, the planning board? I know a lot of numbers were thrown out today. So are you informed about that? Do you have the numbers in front of you, the worst case?
The worst case scenario.
That's right. Let's say we have to really, recalculate the numbers.
What is the worst case? You tell me what the
That's
worst
what,
case scenario.
I'm getting to that. So we recalculate the numbers.
Yep.
And there are 800 kids instead of the 400.
Mm-hmm.
And now the numbers are totally out of context, right? So that's the worst case I'm talking about. What happens then? That's what the town wants to understand. Because there are two sides of the story always. One my side, one the opposite side, and one that's true right in the middle. Right? So we need to understand both sides of the story. So they also want to vote, be a part of the vote, because of the fact that they think there are a lot of numbers being thrown around. today, and they don't believe they're right. So we want the best case scenario, which we heard. Now the worst case scenario, let's hear that. And then I want the town planning board to take a decision based on both the numbers. This has been always a one-sided number for us. So we want both sides.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, sir?
I do have them, but next time, for next time.
If you want to
Thank
type them out, again, send an email to Mr. McGoldrick, that would be helpful.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you. Any other, sir?
Rajesh Velapudi, 355 Grafton Street, Precinct 10, a town meeting member. Two follow-ups, just on the previous comments on 10% of the affordability. So let's say if we have the MBTA's zoning 3A approved, and all the 900 units are in place. So that's that. But then we are also having overall growth in the town. So to my past understanding, we're always chasing that number to pass that. So do we still in a position to fulfill that 10%, or are we still chasing that number?
Well, 15%, you're making progress.
Yeah, but so it's still chasing.
Hey, more bang for your buck is multifamily 40Bs, but, you know, those are gonna be things that are really gonna distress people. But it's more bang for the town's buck.
Right.
In terms of reaching the 10% is a multifamily 40B like Avalon on Route 9 or the one on Route 20. But keeping the affordability restriction in perpetuity, you know.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing, right? We're still chasing, no matter how many developments we are having, we're chasing them.
We're a victim of our own success.
Yes, that's the other side of the story, what Raj said. So the second question I have is, we have the other zoning improvements or amendments that are coming as part of the state budget, ADUs, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So are we considering those additional units that might be coming up so as soon as we adopt the ADU zoning? So what would be the impact on the town overall? Do we have assumptions around those when we combine all these zoning improvements, MBTA improvement, applying the MBTA law and everything? So what would be the overall impact on the town?
Yeah, so in terms of the accessory dwelling units, the intent of our office is to file in February a proposal, an article notice for placement, to this board for placement on the May town meeting warrant. What that will do is when the state passes, when the state ADU legislation becomes effective in February, we will have that zoning set to be reviewed. In May, town meeting presumably will vote on the bylaw that we develop and propose to them in relation to ADUs. Any ADU unit that is generated between February and May will be under whatever bylaw that we pass in May, if any. So the ADU question, it's very complex at this point. What I want to say is that we'll be developing those regulations in terms of the effect on the MBTA zoning. In our proposal, the ADU bylaw would not have an effect on that. What we would be doing is looking at, when we write our ADU bylaw for May, what is the impact of ADUs on multifamily zoning, and what can we do in terms of, under that legislation, what can we do to limit or prohibit accessory dwelling units with multifamily use? So I think that it's a question that's probably, I'll have more accurate answers and information on those effects, and we are evaluating that, but that'll be something to be addressed in the May town meeting with our ADU bylaw.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Sir?
Will Harrington, 32 Longfellow Road, Precinct 1. So I have a few questions for the board. How certain are we that these projections are accurate? And have these projections that we've had in the past regarding units, housing, education, police, fire, have they been accurate in the past? And can we get like a best case scenario, worst case scenario, and somewhere in the middle perhaps, directed towards the town manager? Or you, Chair?
Well, I'd probably defer to the town manager because he can give you more specifics, but my understanding is when we looked at the, how it's borne out, and again, the town manager can, again, give more specifics, that two projects that this board approved in the recent past were the Quinn at Lakeway Commons and Edgemere, and the apartments at Edgemere Crossing where the Market Basket is. And it's my understanding that just based on the impact reports that the developer submitted, that at least in terms of school-age children, that the actual numbers were on the lighter side of what was projected. I don't know how you.
Yeah.
I don't know how you how you apply the police, fire, et cetera, but again, I think those projects have been overall significantly revenue positive when taking into account everything.
Sure.
Again, I defer to the town manager who has a better handle.
So that was a point that I was trying to make before. We're using actual data off of what's actually happening in Shrewsbury when development comes to town. So if you look at what fiscal impact studies were done, we have those for, say, Lakeway Commons. We have those for Edgemere. The projected number of students were much greater than we've actually experienced, right? And those units are all rented out. They were rented out nearly instantaneously when they opened up. So, we have those data, and I recited that before. That's why I think using our actual experience and data here in Shrewsbury makes the most sense, right? You can use you can use whatever number that you want to use. You can say that there's going to be 25 kids per unit, right? But the reality is we have the data that has occurred in the community.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at police and fire, we use national standards. So for the police, we use FBI, aggregate standards, 2.4 officers per 1,000 residents.
Yep.
Okay, so when we look at the fire standards, those don't ring in my head as we always do, 1.43 firefighters per resident. So not only beyond the school students do we know how many residents or how many school students are within those individual department developments, we know how many total residents there are because of the census that we do every year.
Mm-hmm.
So we've taken those numbers and I know that Edgemere Crossing has 426 residents, 1.704 residents per unit, right? And so I multiply that across our standards. That tells me that, we need a half an officer for the impact of the Edgemere development.
Okay.
Right.
So we feel fairly accurate that these projections that we're giving, if this thing passes, that they are accurate. Yeah.
We spent a lot of time on them using the data that we have based upon our current budget.
Okay. So is this the best case scenario, worst case, or somewhere in the middle?
So I've used the middle, right?
Okay.
So as I've said, when we look at the multifamily developments within the community, on average, from Madison Place, Audubon, Shrewsbury, Quinn 35, and Edgemere Crossing, 0.1927 students per unit, right? We've used, in the 407 number that was talked before, 0.44 students per unit.
Mm-hmm.
And that number comes from our development in town, Audubon, Shrewsbury, that has the greatest number of children per unit, which is 0.44 units. So the best case scenario, if you want to look at it that way, is 0.1927 times the number of units, which would be about 210 students that would come from 924 additional units.
Okay. All right, thank you. I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
More questions?
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Again, if you don't have any yet, we'll be back here in a week and think about them, and if you thought about them in advance, it'd be helpful so we could try to get you something more meaningful, because sense there's some frustration in some of the answers, but sometimes it's tough for us to try to answer a question if we hadn't analyzed the specific aspect of data you were asking for. If there are no questions, I guess I would or comments, I would entertain a motion to continue the public hearing on zoning warrant article, Roman numeral 20, section Roman numeral 3, capital ABC, and Roman numeral 7 dot, Roman numeral 10, MBTA, parent TOD, and parent zoning until Thursday, October 24th at 7 PM.
So moved.
Yeah.
Correct, it'll be a public hearing.
All right, well, you know what? I'm not gonna close the meeting. That's why I didn't close the meeting. I didn't vote to close the meeting, because we knew we were continuing it. So we'll be open, yes. Well, no, he was, this is gonna be an open, public hearing on October 24th, Thursday, October 24th at 7 PM. So, do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Do we have to finish the agenda?
Oh, we have to finish the agenda. Okay. Chris, any new business?
No new business,
Any old business?
no old business.
Any correspondence?
No correspondence for this evening.
Then
Chair, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I move that we conclude this evening's hearing.
Second.
Second.
Second and vote.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you.